Thank you for the introduction. And a great comment was made on the efficiency of air conditioners and appliances, and then people spending or consuming more than they should be just because they think they have energy efficient equipment in their buildings. This leads perfectly into the topic I'll be talking about today, because we're introducing a scheme to rate buildings, actually. So if you end up squeezing a lot of energy efficient equipment and machines in your building, but you're still consuming a lot of energy, then your building rating will reflect that. We've been working on a rating scheme for a few years, and I always like to start with the question, why, in my talks and my conversations. So why should we rate buildings? There's always this saying and song and dance about what gets measured can be managed, data is power, knowledge is power. So why we want to rate buildings, one of the reasons is that we want to collect data. There's a huge existing stock of buildings in Dubai on which we know little on energy performance. So we want to collect data to know more about that performance. We want to inform people. We want people to make informed options or choices when they want to rent or buy property. So we want to tell them how efficient buildings are. And we want to inform decision-making on the policy level, strategy level, initiatives level in Dubai. So we want authorities to make the proper decisions when they're tweaking or when they're developing strategies such as the strategy we have in Dubai, which is Demand-Side Management 2030. On the other hand, we want to stimulate action. So once we know how good or bad the building is performing, we want to encourage improvements in that performance. We want to reduce energy and water consumption. So if you have that knowledge, if you have that data, you'd be able to tailor your actions so that you can actually reduce the footprint of your property. And we want to improve the penetration of Program 2 of the strategy that I mentioned, Demand-Side Management Strategy. So Program 2 is about building retrofit. We want to address existing buildings to make them more efficient. And last but not least, we want to add value. In terms of what? We want to increase the value of high-performing buildings. This nicely ties with the topics of this festival and this event. The construction sector, property sector, we want this to eventually find itself into the value of the building. If your building is energy efficient, if it performs well, if it gets a high rating, then maybe that be of added value to you as an owner or occupier. And we also want to create jobs and maybe create revenue streams through those audits, through some retrofit activity, and it's all a win-win situation. So if a client ends up, or a building owner ends up spending some money on improving the efficiency of their buildings, they're gonna make a revenue stream through the savings they will achieve through those retrofit projects. Now, a bit of background on how the scheme evolved and how the idea evolved. It started with a key stakeholder consultation. So we gathered the key energy players in Dubai, and we sat and spoke about the main principles and objectives of a rating scheme. So we had people from Dubai Municipality, Supreme Council of Energy, us from the RSB, Trakhis, the Land Department, Ittihad ESCO, the Super ESCO in Dubai, and we agreed on certain principles and objectives for that scheme. Taking this a step further, we ran a couple of consultancy projects, and I remember a few years back, specifically in this room, we spoke about some benchmarks, or at least launching a project for benchmarking buildings in Dubai, and in order to compare the buildings that we assess to the means, to the averages, and to the scale that we will develop for Dubai. So from that came out the scheme design, implementation plan, some details. We considered a lot of normalization options, which I'll get to in a coming slide. And then out of that, we thought there should be a more focused stakeholder engagement. So if we are to roll out such a scheme, who will administer the scheme? What are the challenges? What are the potential roles? Is data available? How do we deal with those challenges? So eventually, the scheme evolved into the idea of having an online rating tool, which will offer basically two options for the public. One is a free option, another is a paid service that we'll explain later. And we want this to be widely accessible to the public. So just to tell you a bit about our approach for building rating, we looked at several schemes from around the world. We looked at what's already available in the UAE and neighboring countries. So basically, there are a few ways of looking at building ratings. It can either be an asset rating, so we assess what features are inherent in that building, exactly as they rate air conditioners, theoretical performance of buildings and equipment. And there is the operational rating or actual performance rating, depending on how much the building actually consumes. And another way of looking at it is through a whole building and a base building approach. So when you look at a building, do you want to know how much is affected by the behavior of the tenants or by the base building, which includes your common areas, your lifts, your common air conditioning if you're centrally serviced. So we want to capture that side because a lot of energy consumption is influenced by consumer behavior. So if it happens that your building is occupied by people who consume a lot of energy, then you will get a bad rating. So what we want to focus on is the base building approach. And we want to focus on residential and office buildings for many reasons. One of them is that we found it very complex and complicated to rate hotels, for example, or schools or other types of buildings. So we ran the benchmark project on offices and residential buildings. Data was available. It's easier, relatively, to rate those buildings. So we want to rate office and residential buildings, and what we basically look at is actual performance or energy intensity. How much does your building consume divided by how big your building is, and then you get that intensity, kilowatt hours per meter square per year. A very simple metric. Now, how do you compare that performance to others? We took a statistically representative sample of Dubai buildings, around 250 buildings, and we calculated the averages, the means, and the standard deviation. So I won't get into a lot of detail of statistics, but what we did is we created a scale. So depending on where your building falls within that scale, depending on how many standard deviations it's away from that average, you get a rating. And what we made sure is that it reflects significant differences in performance. So if you're just a percentage point away from your neighbor, you won't suddenly get a totally different rating. There's enough buffer in each of those scales, as you can see in the colors. So we wanted this to be statistically representative, and that can be updated live with more buildings getting rated. Then we can revisit those values, and then we revisit the scale. So the design principles of this tool were pretty simple. They were simple, effective, trusted tool, where it sits in the center and it creates a link between the RSB, us as a regulator, the end user, and energy auditors. We wanted this to be trusted, so we wanted energy auditors to look at the rating and to verify it. So the RSB offers access to both auditors and end users to that tool. We offer building rating and a certificate at the end of the day. The auditor gets access to building information through the owner of the building. There's some sort of agreement between the two, maybe a fee, definitely a fee. And then the RSB already accredits energy auditors, so we will use those energy auditors to verify the performance of buildings. So basically, we want something that is of easy access and simple user interface. No one wants to complicate their life as a building owner to get a rating. We want minimum requirements from the users. We don't want it to take them hours and hours to fill out forms just to get a rating. Someone can do that for them if they pay them, the energy auditor. We want this tool to be manageable and scalable. So we start with office buildings and residential buildings, and we can expand that. We want professional verification through energy auditors. And finally, we want to be able to audit that process. We want to audit the auditor. So we randomly pick ratings performed by those auditors, and we audit them ourselves. Now, we expect to launch this tool later this year. It will be 3 simple steps to get an indicative rating by the end user. They just need to enter some basic building info, basically prerequisites to be able to rate your building, office, residential, and then some utility consumption data, and then it spits out an indicative rating. And you have the option to either discard that rating or actually get it verified. If you want to get it verified, you just register as a user, create a profile, and then you provide additional information on the building, just identifying the location, and then you select an auditor. The auditor does some work, looks at documentation, consumption, all of that, and that goes back to the tool. The RSB verifies it, and we issue a certificate at the end of the day. So basically, it should be a smooth, simple process. A lot of work has gone into that principle, getting it finally to a simple, easy accessible, and widely accessible format.